Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This lecture is for medical students of AL-IRAQIA University, the first grade. We will describe in this lecture the anatomical body cavities. As we all know that inside the body we have spaces, and these spaces are usually for allowing a surface for several organs, for protection of the inside of these organs. And they are generally divided into two cavities. Yani the two main cavities are the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. If we come into the dorsal cavity, we can describe it as the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity or the spinal cavity. This is called the dorsal, while the ventral cavity, which is in front, consists of the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity in between. Okay, when we come to the cranial cavity, it is inside the skull and it protects the brain. When we come to the vertebral canal, or called the spinal canal, or the vertebral cavity, it is formed by the vertebrae when they are aligned one over another, and there will be a tube occupying the spinal cord with its serous membrane coverings. When we describe the thoracic cavity, which is part of the ventral cavity, it is usually formed within the thoracic cage. The breastbone is in front and the vertebral column is behind, separated from the abdominopelvic cavity by a diaphragm, a muscular diaphragm, الحجاب الحاجز. The abdominopelvic cavity is usually one single cavity because there is no diaphragm, no separation between the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity. So it is one entity, the abdominopelvic cavity. But the pelvic cavity is called the true cavity. Usually it is within the pelvic bone. مع عظم الحوض بالداخل، هذا يسموه the true pelvic cavity. طبعا we all know that these cavities, هنا طبعا it's a table which can illustrate the cavities, الشرح مالتها وشنو الorgans اللي موجودة in each cavity. If I come to each cavity, it is lined from inside by a serous membrane. أكو غشاء تغطي الكافيتيز من الداخل. In each cavity راح يصير إلى اسم خاص. هذا السيرس ممبرين الموجود راح يصير إلى اسم خاص. مثلا if we come to, for example, خلينا نرجع على أول صورة يمكن أكثر تكون بها فائدة. Yes, this picture. The serous membrane that lines the cranial cavity is the same serous membrane that lines the vertebral cavity, and it is called meninges. Okay, the meninges. The meninges يعني is the only term to the serous membrane that surrounds both the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. Okay, the serous membrane that surrounds the thoracic cavity is called اللي surround the pleura. هي thoracic cavity ترى مقسمة إلى 3 cavities. نفس thoracic cavity يتكون من 3 spaces inside. On each side, هاي منا ومنا يسموها the pleural cavities, occupying the 2 lungs, الرئتين. The serous membrane surrounding the pleural cavities is called the pleura. Okay, in the middle, I have a space which is called the mediastinum. In mediastinum is a space in the midline, extending from the sternum in front and the vertebra behind. It has inside a space for the heart. The serous membrane يسموه pericardial cavity. The serous membrane surrounding the heart is called pericardium. The pericardium. فصار عندي pleural cavity, صار عندي pericardial cavity also, and the mediastinum, which is a septum in the midline. مغطاية by pleura and pericardium. The abdominopelvic cavity, the lining serous membrane, is called peritoneum. Peritoneum. Okay? من نيجي على consistency of this serous membrane دائما يتكون of an outer parietal layer and an inner visceral layer. outer parietal layer يعني الجداري هو اللي يكون قريب دائما من الوول, while the inner visceral layer هو اللي يكون intimate لاطش على الأورجنز اللي موجودة. فرح يصير عندنا outer parietal layer and an inner visceral layer. And usually in between these two layers, there is a small potential space. And this space could be, we find in it mils of fluid. Usually this fluid is used for lubrication, لسهولة lubrication الموجود. And it is secreted usually from the visceral layer. دائما من الvisceral layer هو secretion of the fluid الموجود. فمن أجي مثلا على البلورا راح نلقي outer parietal layer, inner visceral layer, pleural cavity in between, pleural fluid containing pleural fluid. البريكارديوم outer parietal layer أو يسموه fibrous pericardium, والinner visceral pericardium, وin between pericardial cavity containing pericardial fluid. من نجي على البريتونيوم outer parietal layer, inner visceral layer, in between we have the peritoneal cavity containing the peritoneal fluid وهكذا. بالنسبة إلى المننجيز تختلف. ما عندي outer parietal و inner visceral. المننجيز تتكون من 3 طبقات, وهذه الطبقات بعدين تدرسوها يعني, وحتى السبيسز بيناتها كلش مهمة, وشنو occupying each space موجود, وش اسمه الفلويد اللي موجود اللي هو CSF, هذا كله بعدين بالمرحلة الثانية تدرسوها إن شاء الله. Okay, so this is regarding the cavities with the organs present in each cavity. وقلنا الcavity is not only for occupying the organs but also acts for protection of some of the important organs which are present. This is generally speaking about the cavities. وهنا موجودة عندكم من تجي على الباوربوينت راح تلقي شرح كامل للي ذكرته هسه. شوفوا هاي هنا بلورا, هاي بريكارديوم. عندنا بالنسبة إلى الأورجنز اللي موجودة inside the abdomen, some of them either are called intraperitoneal يعني مغطاية بالبريتونيوم, أو some of the organs are called retroperitoneum يعني they lie behind the peritoneum and usually they are against the body wall. هذه نحاول إن شاء الله بالمختبر نحاول نوضحها لكم, أو بالميتينج بالجوجل ميت نحاول نركز عليها أكثر, يعني نفهم لك إياها أكثر وشون يصير ليش قسم من الأورجنز تصير intraperitoneal وليش قسم منها تصير retroperitoneum, إلى علاقة بالdevelopment بالembryology of it. The rest of the lecture we mention it in our lab, شرحت لكم إياه بشكل مفصل جدا اللي هي abdominopelvic regions with its quadrants. I حكيت عن first method اللي قسمه إلى 9 regions, وحكيت أيضا وراها عن the second method اللي هو the surgical method اللي قسمه into 4 regions. This was the end of this lecture. Hopefully you will get benefit from it. Illustrate the questions that you want to be asked, and we will answer it in our Google Meet. Thank you very much.